My mother's the one who's 103. So we're hi, Stuart Weinberg, calling the meeting to order. You want to tell us about the compliance with the Freedom of Information Act?
I do, yes. In compliance with the Freedom of Information Act, notice of this meeting was posted and agendas were distributed to news media and persons requesting notification.
Thank you. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes from May 13th? Second, any corrections, statements? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. All right. Way to go. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Molly and we're going to do resilience first.
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. So today we're going to have some resilience updates. We're going to talk about the multi-hazard vulnerability assessment that was adopted or completed in October of 2024. The last time this committee saw an update from this project was, I believe, in February of 2024, which was right before we started doing community engagement for the project. So there's a lot more to talk about and findings and things to learn from that. And so we want to talk about what's in this assessment today, but also have time to talk about how we're going to implement it and what strategies we can pull from it to keep moving resilience activities forward. So first, we'll start with a presentation from Stephen Jolka. Stephen is with Fernleaf. Fernleaf was the consulting firm that that we worked with to complete the assessment. And I'll let you take it from here, Stephen. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Stephen.
Do I need to stand by a microphone?
No.
I think you're good.
Oh.
Yeah.
Everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's everywhere.
It's up here.
Everywhere. Big brother. Great. Well, yeah, good morning. My name is Stephen Jolka. I am with Fernleaf. We did work with county staff to develop the multi-hazard vulnerability assessment. Just briefly, a little bit about myself. I am based in Western North Carolina, up in the mountains. But before that, I spent about a dozen years working for the city of Charleston. So I'm very familiar with the landscape of the Lowcountry. And so it was a real pleasure for me to get to work on this project because it was, it sort of felt like it was still my backyard. So really excited to share a little bit about this with you. This slide should really sort of say like vulnerability assessment plus, because we're gonna actually spend a good chunk of today sort of looking at like what's next. And we are really just going to be touching on the tip of the iceberg today. There's so much information in that vulnerability assessment report. There's even more data on the online tool. It's called ExcelAdapt. Is our online interactive tool that shows all the data. There's so much there. I am not going to get through even just a speck of that today, but I'm hoping that I'll leave you with a good impression of what the assessment process accomplished, and then, as I said, sort of talk about where can we go from here. So. What have I done?
You want to try and lose the mouse instead?
All right. I think that's working. I think maybe it just went to sleep.
Oh, okay.
All right. So a little bit about sort of how we started and moved through the assessment as a project. We had a lot of conversations with a lot of people, which was really great because that helped inform really what the priorities were for the county from a lot of different people at the county. We worked really closely with the Chief Resilience Officer. We did several workshops and meetings with different groups. One was just sort of like a larger staff working group here at the county. We also had a focus group of sort of community stakeholders from different communities throughout the county, as well as then a group of mostly department heads to talk sort of about how they could use the assessment data in their departments and their roles. We did provide a few updates to both this committee and to county council. We also rounded out the assessment by doing a training with staff on the ExcelAdapt tool and sort of working through how to use and maximize the capabilities of that tool. We do have a recording of that training, so if anyone here is interested in sitting through that training, please let me know or let Molly know, and we'll get you hooked up with that recording. And if you want access to ExcelAdapt, we can make that happen. And then, of course, the final report, which is really, really long, but it is hopefully set up in a way as kind of a reference tool that you can sort of flip to what you need and find the information that you're looking for. What our assessment is rooted in the Steps to Resilience. It's a framework for moving through an assessment process. And you can see here that it's really a sort of iterative process that we're sort of constantly kind of checking back in throughout that process to make sure that we're capturing priorities appropriately, we're capturing different stakeholder needs appropriately, and making sure that we're sort of staying centered on what the community is looking for. It is easy when you get into this kind of resilience work, it's kind of easy to spin off into like idealism land. And so it's important to always check in throughout that process of, you know, what is Charleston County looking for here, and are we delivering that? So it's sort of rooted in this process throughout the assessment. We are. So when we talk about resilience, when we do an assessment, a vulnerability assessment, what we are really looking for is to avoid this situation on the left-hand side of the screen. We want to avoid any type of hazard that causes enough loss in functional capacity that there's a tipping point that we cannot get back to the pre-hazard functionality. Our goal is to be operating on the right-hand side of the screen there and really focusing on just that first section there, the investments that build resilience. And so the vulnerability assessment sort of specifically is trying to zero in on that part of thinking about resilience. Resilience is a big topic, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that fits under that umbrella of resilience. For the assessment, we're really focused on identifying opportunities for those investments that build resilience, help us avoid that tipping point scenario so that as we move through and past a hazard, we're returning to at least the functional capacity that we were before that hazard, if not maybe better. So that's really where we're focused in when we're talking about the vulnerability assessment here. When we talk about vulnerability, this is an image that is a good example of differences in vulnerability. If we'll just assume that all three of these homes are in a coastal area in Charleston County, okay? All three of these homes have the same exposure to a flooding hazard. But these three homes all have a pretty different vulnerability to that same flooding hazard. And so when we are looking at a vulnerability assessment, we're taking it, you know, quite a bit beyond just looking at the exposure aspect. We're pulling in a whole bunch of data that helps us understand vulnerability. In this case, one of those bits of data would be looking at elevation of a building to understand which properties, which neighborhoods are more vulnerable to that same hazard. Okay. Also, let me just, I forgot to say this again, please stop me at any point if we want to dig in on any one of these concepts or
This group's not sure.
Okay, great, perfect, great. I don't need to be talking the entire time, so please butt in. One of the earlier sort of workshop meetings that we had with staff was identifying the community assets that were important for Charleston County. These are the asset categories that were identified. Each one of these categories then has sort of sub asset types that fall into them that really like get into a lot of granular detail about different types of assets, and also getting into thinking about criticality of assets, which asset types really require the most attention or the most resources or the most amount of protection in the event of a hazard. So for example, a fire station has a higher criticality score than a warehouse, right? So we like dive deep into all those different asset types, assign criticality scores to each one, and that also gets into that calculation of vulnerability. Then we pull in the hazards, right? These are all the things that are potential impacts to the assets that we've identified. These were the ones that we identified with the county staff working group. Obviously, flooding is probably the biggie, right? That's not a surprise to any of us. With that in mind, we actually looked at 9 different flooding scenarios in terms of looking at that exposure aspect of determining vulnerability. The go-to is FEMA, right? The go-to is the FEMA maps. Any of us who have worked with those FEMA maps know that while they are a good starting point, they certainly do not paint the entire picture of risk. There are plenty of areas throughout Charleston County that we know are exposed to flooding, but do not show up as a high hazard on those flood insurance rate maps.
We learned a lot from Hillary.
Yep.
Winter as well.
Yep. Well, and the big thing there is that the FEMA modeling does not include pluvial flooding. It doesn't include tidal flooding. So anyway, that is why we pulled in, as I said, 9 different flooding scenarios, 9 different modeled exposures for flooding, so that we could paint a really complete picture of flooding exposure that then is the foundation for learning about vulnerability. We did use future modeling as well. That's the other thing, that FEMA maps don't include any sort of sea level rise projection. So that was an important part, was looking at future projections related to flooding. So we spent a lot of time on flooding, and we won't get really deep into that today, but happy to follow up with any of you if you want to learn more. It is also we do a deeper dive on all of the different flooding scenarios in the report as well, all 9 of them. Okay, so then this is where everything gets crunched, right? So this is Excel Adapt. I'm just going to give you like a really kind of brief, high-level introduction to the Excel Adapt platform and sort of what it produces for y'all. It is our interactive web tool for incorporating all of this different data into one place, and then producing a really functional, usable platform for y'all to make decisions that are based on data. So I'll just point out sort of a few of the kind of, nice capabilities of Excel Adapt from a decision-making standpoint. You can see that this spits out a parcel level analysis of vulnerability. That parcel level analysis can be aggregated to pretty much any scale that we want. We can aggregate it to neighborhood boundaries. We can aggregate it to census block groups, census tracts, but it all starts out on the parcel level and then can be summarized to larger planning scales if you want. You can also define custom boundaries. So you can draw specific boundaries that you want to summarize that vulnerability data. So if you're considering a specific, drainage infrastructure project, and you want that particular project to serve these, 4 blocks, you can draw a custom boundary around those 4 blocks and understand the vulnerability data for those 4 blocks to help inform the feasibility of that project. This is an example where the parcel level analysis, you can see it really clearly identifies individual parcels that have a really high vulnerability. And in this case, this was in New Bern, North Carolina, and they actually, this led to them acquiring several of the properties that you see in the dark red there. And they turned this whole space into a really lovely community green space that flooded when it flooded, and then was a nice usable recreational space when it wasn't flooded. And so that's the kind of thing that the sorts of decisions that can be made from here. We also layer in, there are lots of layers that you can turn on and turn off in Excel Adapt. And one of them is layering in networked infrastructure on top of that parcel level analysis, so you can understand where things like your stormwater infrastructure, your other utility infrastructure, streets and sidewalks, where those exist in relation to the vulnerabilities of specific parcels or specific neighborhoods. And so it provides a really great platform for doing that sort of interdepartmental collaboration for identifying priorities for projects. This is looking at heat, and which is probably, I would argue, is sort of like second after the flooding hazard, probably the next most kind of highest priority hazard for Charleston County. And so you're able to, I talked about how you can sort of aggregate that vulnerability data. So this is that vulnerability data aggregated to census block groups. And then schools, all those little yellow dots are school properties. So you can identify those individual points of a specific asset type shown on top of that aggregated vulnerability data. So that shows you where you have concentrations of that asset type, but it also shows you the vulnerabilities of those asset types on kind of a larger planning scale. So in this case, it was something like 23-24% of the school properties were in census block groups that had a high vulnerability to heat. And also really great communication tool. We all of us who have worked in local government know that half of the battle is communicating all of the really awesome work that we're doing to our residents. And so it's a great way to help you all do that. In this case, these were check valves that were installed along Morrison Drive down in the peninsula. And this is sort of like a before and after of the installation of those check valves. This was a situation where we drew a custom boundary for them. We identified the specific area that we wanted to improve that tidal flooding issue. And we did a before and after comparison. Within that custom boundary, 50% of the churches were no longer highly vulnerable to that tidal flooding threat after the check valves were installed. 20%, if y'all are familiar with that area, there's a lot of public housing in that area. So great, it's a great way to communicate, the impact of the work that y'all are doing. Yes?
Could you go back to that slide?
Absolutely.
Is that the location of the new Morrison Yard apartment complex? Or is it just up So that looks like that's an agreement.
Yeah. Right here.
Okay.
Yep.
It's up further. Yeah, this is lower. This is closer to where, you get the old, you get on the old bridge.
Okay, so that's not integration.
Sanders, isn't it Sanders Flat Elementary School?
Right, so the elementary school is right here.
Yeah.
Here.
That's right,
Yeah, so Morrison, you're right.
right.
Yeah, Morrison Yard's right there. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. So the only issue is to make sure that we get maintenance and check valves.
Right.
I have a story I'll share another time. With you check valves. Or I'll do it right now. Very simple. October, Halloween, 1991. Very significant in the coast of the United States. It was the day of the enormous tide presented by the greatest storm off the coast of Nova Scotia. It was 3 storms became one. They actually made a movie of this, right? I was the superintendent of schools on Long Island, and I got a call that the streets are flooded. It's a sunny day, it's absolutely beautiful. What's going on? I mean, nobody could figure this out. The streets were actually flooded. It was the first time I ever saw a car float in my life. We had schools we were closing. That was just absolutely amazing. Again, sunny day, no wind, no nothing. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we finally found the problem. They had installed all these check valves along Long Island Sound years ago, but nobody ever looked at them, and they were all stuck in the open position. So when this storm surge from this great storm came into Long Island Sound, it pushed the water had nowhere to go but into the check valves that were stuck in the open position and flooded the street. So every time I see this, I digress because it's really important that if we don't have the maintenance on the check valves, they're worthless.
You're right.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll just pause there for just a second. Any questions specific to sort of the approach to doing an assessment and kind of Excel Adapt as a tool? We're gonna get into the specific assessment findings. Yeah.
I guess just one question. So you mentioned about how you already have indices that combine exposure and other census tracker or other variables that go into that. Can you disentangle that in this system, or can you just look at exposure and
Yes.
just look at the vulnerability?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and Molly and I debated this about whether to actually open it up and do a live demo for y'all. In the interest of time, we thought we might not be able to, because it's really cool. And when you open it up and you start playing around in there, like you do sort of like go down a rabbit hole and you'll never get back out of it. So again, if you want to watch the recording of that training, or if you want to set up another time that we can do that deep dive, happy to do that. But in the interest of time today, we chose not to go there. But yes, so you can look at only exposure. You can look at only adaptive capacity. So adaptive capacity is like looking at that photograph of the 3 houses. So you can look at which areas have a higher adaptive capacity. So even if you have a very high flood risk, if you also have a high adaptive capacity, then maybe that doesn't need to be a high priority. If you have an area that's a high flood risk and a low adaptive capacity, then you're in trouble. That's where you need to focus in. So you totally turn on and off all those different components of vulnerability, which is really, really useful to being able to make those decisions and those prioritization. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
We're getting ready to start the public works guy that started flooding projects. I forgot where it's at. But can you look at that and tell us the effectiveness of that project? It was in the news here lately. I gotta get the project that is just award.
So conceptually, yes. And so like this is kind of a good example of that. we would need to be able to do that, we would need to have sort of before and after data. We can, just because we would need to know like the exact specs of that project, in order to know how it would impact exposure, and so there's a little bit of modeling work that goes into that. But the answer to your question is yes, we would need to have a little bit more data in order to get there. Yeah. Anything else at the moment before we?
Are you gonna talk later about your mapping and how that compared with FEMA, the effects of Helene and the stuff that y'all did in Nashville later?
I wasn't planning on it,
Okay.
but
Never mind.
we can, if y'all wanna go there. We can, let's see what sort of time we have.
Okay.
And, yeah, yeah, a lot of lessons from Helene. Yeah. All right, but let's focus on Charleston for now. Okay, so we did an assessment of the entire county. We also separately created kind of summaries of the vulnerability data for each of the planning summary areas throughout the county. That's what you see there. But again, the assessment itself is all parcel level, and we aggregated to these 15 planning areas. Here, okay, there is so much data in there, and it's really, really difficult to pull out even key findings. So these are some key findings, but maybe more so than that, these are kind of examples of findings that can be pulled out of that assessment data. So wind is a big concern. Obviously, you can see there are a lot of properties that are exposed to wind, so that's one where we would calculate, in order to determine adaptive capacity related to wind, we look at the construction year of a building, associated with when the wind code requirements for building code came into place. So basically, before there was a wind code, those properties have a lower adaptive capacity.
What's in the wind code? It's the first time I've ever heard we had a wind code.
It has specific design standards to just help prevent damage from wind. So specific like anchoring requirements,
Okay.
Roofing, window requirements. I'm not
But they're probably
an
minimum,
expert on
minimum, especially like window requirements, because most windows are not strong. That's
Yeah, I
interesting.
think there's some in the international codes on
Okay, okay.
wind,
Yeah.
and then also when you get to roofing, there's a specific nail
Yeah,
biter that you have to do.
Yeah, on anchoring.
It goes, yeah, it goes
Right.
on and on and on.
And half the construction, it's not following those recommendations on roof.
But they are, yeah, in the international codes.
Okay, earthquake. Earthquake is a really interesting one. That one, we look at soil types, to look at soft soils versus harder soils. And also look at, the construction of your buildings, because there are also a set of codes related to earthquake. And so looking at which buildings are more susceptible to earthquake. Wildfire, also a big concern. There are a lot of properties vulnerable to wildfire. That has mostly to do with location than anything else. These last three are sort of big ones in my mind. It was interesting for us to find so many properties throughout the county that have multiple vulnerabilities. We thought that it was significant to note that it's not like over here is susceptible to flooding, over here is susceptible to wildfire, over here is susceptible to this and that and the other thing. There were a lot of parts of the county where there were multiple vulnerabilities, multiple hazards. Access also really critical. That will be a really important consideration as we sort of move through to kind of development of strategies, is considering access during any sort of hazard event. Last one, looking from a vulnerability perspective, so not just looking at exposure, but again, taking that extra step to consider criticality, consider adaptive capacity to get us to vulnerability. Vulnerability in a 100-year event looks very similar to vulnerability in a 20-year event. That is a little bit concerning because that tells us that we don't need to wait around for those really big events. Even smaller events have a really big impact from a vulnerability perspective. So that was a really interesting finding out of that. I'll just highlight a few of the maps. Again, like there's so much information, but just highlight a few for y'all to kind of get an impression of what is in there. So we're looking at critical infrastructure properties, critical facilities. You see the types of them there. 14% of those properties across the county are highly vulnerable in a 20-year flooding event. This is using the USGS Cosmos data set. That's a significant number of critical facilities. Another way to present some findings, we did some charts like this. As I mentioned before, a big goal of looking at 9 different modeled flooding scenarios was to understand vulnerability outside of the FEMA regulatory floodplain. And so you can see here, this is sort of looking at the adaptive capacity again. So you can see the dark green, those are properties that were constructed before participation in the National Flood Insurance Program, before there were any base flood elevation, minimum elevation requirements, versus after participation in the NFIP began, so there was a minimum elevation requirement with the base flood elevation, versus when the county adopted their first 1-foot freeboard requirement. So looking at sort of how that adaptive capacity again impacts vulnerability. But 20% of buildings throughout the county and beyond just the regulatory floodplain from FEMA are vulnerable to flooding.
One comment, I think that this is an opportunity because there's a lot of discussion amongst council on how we can fund projects to mitigate flooding. And so this is an opportunity to take advantage of that discussion, whether or not it's another, any sales tax or something. How do we get enough money to sequentially fix flooding? So this is an opportunity here to take advantage of.
Well, you have planted a beautiful seed. We will come back to that very point. All right. This is also probably no surprise to anyone sitting in this room, but we do expect flooding to get worse, which means that we expect vulnerabilities to increase throughout the county. So I said we looked at both currently modeled flooding scenarios as well as future modeling that includes a sea level rise component. And so, again, not shocking here, we see an increase in properties that are highly vulnerable to flooding when you include a future component. So what all do we get out of this? So we have a beautiful assessment report. Within that report, we include a lot of maps. We also include a lot of key findings, but probably, and we have these planning area summaries, so we have a specific data summary for each one of those 15 planning areas. Lots of appendices with lots of tables that anyone who likes tables will have a lot of fun with. But probably kind of most consequential, most interesting, perhaps, for those of us who are planners, is our strategies and action section. Once we got through the actual assessment of data, that's when it sort of became crunch time with staff. We worked through all that data, and from all that, we sort of boiled it down into 11 strategies and actions, strategies with actions that county staff agreed this is where we need to focus. These are the areas that we need to dig in and get to work. Those strategies, we take what we call a whole of government approach. So we don't only focus on funding. We don't only focus on land use ordinances. We don't only focus on stormwater infrastructure. We focus on everything. And we particularly focus in on those types of strategies that have benefits throughout multiple areas of government operations. So if we can identify strategies that have a specific impact on drainage, but also will allow for a commercial corridor to be developed more fully, that's a win, right? If we can accomplish multiple benefits through the same strategy, great. So we take this whole government approach, and we don't need to go through each one of these. I'm including all 11 of those strategies up here, but just again to kind of give you a taste of what these are. These are also, again, we have this whole government approach, so many of these strategies can fall into multiple categories on this little wheel here. But I tried to kind of categorize them a little bit into sort of where they might live primarily. And this is sort of our policy and planning type of strategies. A focus on developing a prioritization framework for flood mitigation projects. Hold on to that one, we're gonna come back to that in a second. Emergency facilities, coordination across emergency facilities across multiple jurisdictions, really difficult, but really important. Also using county facilities as a model, right? Using those properties, those buildings as a model for what could be done, what should be done, so that you can point to those to follow suit.
So for each one of these, you have action plans. So are you going to show us an example of that for one of these?
We are going to take a deep dive into a couple of these.
Okay.
There are a set of more specific kind of objective actions in the report associated with each of these. But we sort of left it there. But I think we're gonna talk about that question in just a few minutes.
Okay.
So hold tight onto that one.
I like the way you're thinking on that.
Yeah.
We can really have an offsite with the council, and they're going through their priorities and
Right, yeah,
strategies and so forth. And this kind of dovetails into one of those strategies in terms of flooding and all that. So.
Yeah.
Okay, these are some that are kind of associated with infrastructure type projects. Drainage system maintenance, to your point, we can.
Well, look what happened in 2015 in Columbia with Joaquin. You had all of these dams that were privately owned first, and you had flooding. They're still trying to get rid of the mold from 2015 down.
Right, so it's not worth building if you don't maintain it. Also, also drainage system maintenance is an opportunity for a whole lot of points in the community rating system. The county is already doing a fantastic job in CRS, but opportunity for a lot of points if you have a really systematic approach to maintenance. Stormwater easements. This is one that is really ripe to dig into in the future. Easements are important not just for maintenance, but also when we think about where stormwater goes. We want those areas of storage and conveyance to be connected. So we want to identify opportunities for expansion of or addition of easements, not just for infrastructure that's in the ground, but for stormwater storage and conveyance to essentially create a floodplain. Identify where that water is going, create a floodplain for that water to go. We have, yeah, I already mentioned county. Okay, right, like ordinances, that's another one that, you know, we could go into that for a long time, but, you know, there's a lot of opportunity for policy work, specifically related to land use. Brownfield redevelopment program, we are gonna get into that one again in just a second. And special protection areas, stormwater special protection areas, looking at special protection areas specifically as one tool in the toolbox to kind of guide development intensity, and sort of where it makes sense to have more development, where it makes less sense to have more development, using those, sort of updating those special protection areas to help guide that. Right, heat, so like a community engagement campaign related to heat, obviously really important one, but also coordination across sort of all of the organizations and agencies that sort of work in that space, particularly our medical organizations in the Charleston area. Okay, well, so much of this work, specifically kind of more like tangible project work, so much of that is traditionally funded by sort of one-off grants, whether it's through FEMA or through HUD or through the state, wherever it is. We have spent so much time writing and administering one-off grants to do one project, just to start that cycle all over again. So we have an opportunity to find ways to develop a more local funding mechanism, to develop a pipeline of prioritized projects, and then a sustainable way of funding those projects. So that we don't have to spend all of our time writing grants. Instead, we can spend our time actually doing the work. So that is one of these strategies that I think everyone in the room agreed wholeheartedly on exploring this one a little bit further. So
without knowing exactly what you're gonna do, to give you an analogy of which the county and other municipalities are doing on energy, they take a look at that. If they're going to spend X amount of dollars today, they're gonna save even more dollars down the road. When you took this all the way to the end, were we able to, or at any point, get to say to the county, if you spend $100,000 this year, it will save you $400,000 in damages in the coming years? Have you been able to do that at all?
That was not part of the scope of this assessment.
Okay.
That would be really interesting, and also would be great evidence to support doing this kind of work, but that was not part of the scope of this project.
But that is a possibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think that's also possibly the only way that you're gonna sell this sometimes, you know?
Right.
Finally here, looking kind of internally, sort of building capacity within the county organization. How do we find ways to start approaching and attacking these strategies? Many of them fall across multiple departments. So how do we start formulating a framework for not just making decisions that require multiple departments to take action, but how are we tracking those actions? How are we tracking success? All right, so I said I would come back and do a deeper dive on a couple of these. We were very lucky to be selected in the very first pilot year to receive a grant under the Climate Smart Communities Initiative to further develop 2 of these 11 strategies. Those 2 are the prioritization framework for flood mitigation projects and the sort of brownfields redevelopment strategy for the county. We selected those 2. Those don't necessarily feel really connected at first, right? Like flooding and brownfields. The reason that we selected those 2 to move forward with were that they both start out as a spatial analysis, and it was a really easy next step to go from the vulnerability assessment to doing this spatial analysis for both flood mitigation opportunities as well as brownfields opportunities. I'm going to launch into that, but this is a great program. We literally picked up. We had not delivered the final report of the vulnerability assessment when we started under this grant program, this new project. So it really led straight into this work. I'm going to show you just a very quick little snippet of what we're working on. We will be delivering the results of those projects in just a couple months here. So stay tuned. We can come back and look at these in more depth. But just to give you an idea, on the flood mitigation side, this is a map looking at census block groups throughout the county. The darker shaded block groups have a higher flooding vulnerability. The lighter shaded block groups have a lower flooding vulnerability. And then the block groups that you see outlined in red, those are the block groups that have the lowest flood insurance coverage. So the starting point of looking at prioritizing flood mitigation projects is understanding who has the ability to recover and who doesn't. So there are a lot of different variables that go into this. This is just one. We also looked at flood insurance claims. We looked at a whole bunch of other stuff. Again, I'm just giving you a little snapshot here of sort of the kind of thing we're looking at. This is not super easy to read. So this is a much easier map to read. This is a map of just the intersection. So just looking at the areas with a high flood vulnerability, but low flood insurance coverage. And you can see that, especially in an area like Charleston County, it can kind of feel overwhelming. It's like, it all floods, everywhere floods. This is helping to, again, sort of narrow it in, help us prioritize where do we need to focus our time and attention and resources. These are the areas that are likely to flood, and people are less likely to be able to recover because they don't have insurance. Last layer, this is including social vulnerabilities. So we use the CGES tool, and so now that yellow hatching just adds in that additional layer of a social vulnerability index score. And you can see then, we've gone from the whole county, and And then we had about 30 block groups that were the intersection of high flood vulnerability, low policy coverage. But now we end up with only 3. There are only 3 block groups that have a high flood vulnerability, low flood insurance coverage, and a high social vulnerability score. So again, we're trying to sort of like take a really big problem and try to narrow it down. Okay? Yeah.
Does low policy coverage also include no coverage?
Yes, yes, yeah, so the low policy, we just take the lowest quantile of policies per building. We do a calculation of policies per building, and then the lowest quantile of that, which would include 0. Yeah, so this is like, again, just like a very quick peek at this, but an idea of the kind of data that goes in that. So now I'm gonna switch over to the brownfield strategy. We do kind of the same analysis, but related to brownfield. So first we identify, this is the Hollywood Ravenel area. We identify land use types that are likely to be brownfields, and then we select out just the properties that are vacant. So they had that land use, they are now vacant. It's a lot, right? A lot. So this is just to like sort of have that baseline understanding. This is now, of course, now we're looking North Charleston, but this is looking at potential brownfield properties, but in block groups that have a high heat vulnerability. So the bright red, those are potential brownfields properties that also fall into these high heat vulnerability areas. So areas that are really great opportunities for redevelopment that could also, improve that that resilience to heat in these areas. This now zooming out to the whole county. This is also looking at heat vulnerability, but adding in a median income layer, that's the hatching. So a low median income for those census block groups. And then again, layering in those bright red properties are kind of those land uses that are potential brownfields. So the point here is a lot of layering of spatial data goes into this, but the ultimate goal is to, again, take a problem that can feel a little overwhelming and help us understanding just where to start. That's kind of half the battle, is where to start. We will, I would love the opportunity to maybe come back and we can dive into those two strategies and that project once we're finished out with it. We're right now, we're just transitioning into kind of the strategy development deliverables stage for that project. So would love to come back and share more on that later.
Who's in charge of that? Is that the city doing that, or is when you say we ain't?
Well, so Fernleaf is leading it.
Okay.
Yep. So we just sort of bridged that straight from the vulnerability assessment into this project. But we get a lot of support from the county. And we also get a lot of support from LAMC, the Low Country Alliance for Model Communities. They're sort of our kind of boots on the ground, community-based organization that helps us. They've helped with a lot of community engagement that's gone into that project to kind of understand, particularly on the brownfield side, understand sort of what people would like to see on some of these brownfield sites. What would have the greatest impact in their neighborhoods.
There's a whole controversy going on the lots is trucks. Right, the one on the river.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and I'll just say too that this work, the brownfields project and the flood mapping that Stephen just showed us, that's a huge benefit to the county because those two projects, those were done at no cost to the county. We were working with Fernleaf and the Climate Smart Communities Initiative was funding that, but since Fernleaf led this vulnerability assessment. They were just that natural, party to kind of see how this assessment could work. So we're in a really good position here. Yeah.
All right, so where do we go from here? And there's a lot of information to work with. There are a lot of different directions to go in. There's obviously a huge opportunity to be communicating this information, either externally, or just be communicating it in a kind of standardized fashion across departments within the county. Continued engagement with community folks. We did have a great experience with the focus group of community stakeholders through the assessment process. We continue to work with those same focus group participants through this current project. Big one is funding, right? It always comes back to money, but the data that has come out of the assessment and then also come out of the current project with flood mitigation and brownfields work is so useful in developing a compelling grant application or just a request for funding. Your request for funding is so much stronger when you have a whole bunch of data to back it up. So this is probably the most critical thing is going after funding and having the data to support those requests.
Can I jump to the fourth one? I almost see that as the number one priority, but I would add to that not only in departmental priorities, but also other plans from the municipalities that are in Charleston County. Because that, I envision that if you do that and we align with not only the county's climate action plan, but all these plans that exist in the county in different municipalities, and just not including the city, how much stronger that would be for the county to take the lead to say to all the municipalities, get someone from all the, people represented from each of the municipalities together and say, all right, we've identified all these issues now, not only as a county, as a city, but as your own little municipality. Now, let's work out what we can do together. That would make it so much stronger.
Yeah, great. You're onto something, Stuart.
I know. And it could be, and just think, I don't know, timing wise, but if we could get something like that in the concept we talked about in sometime in the fall of having this conference.
Yes.
Look at the workout, the breakout sessions you could have on this for all those different groups. It really would be meaningful.
Yeah.
And the county's strategic plan fits right into that.
That's right.
Yeah.
It has all that
That's right.
in it.
Yep. It's all linked. Yep.
And there are also so many existing bridges that we just need to start building them up. The climate action plan puts a lot of emphasis on heat related work. There's a whole lot of data in the assessment to support where to go with that work. There's a big focus on green infrastructure, nature-based solutions. So again, looking at where existing open spaces and natural lands are, where there are opportunities to expand on those through easements or property acquisition. There are so many links there where the assessment can support the goals and objectives in these other functional plans for the county, as well as throughout other jurisdictions. So really, really great. We're sort of standing at that precipice, and it's okay, look, we can get there. We can make that connection, make it happen. So I will end there. And I'll hand it back over to Molly. Any immediate questions for me right now? Otherwise, I'll just be here part of the discussion.
I like the way you went through that and you nailed down the strategy to work certain priority. And in my mind, I keep running to the offsite we're getting ready to have. Councilman, that's why I'm sorry, Chair. is not
Yeah,
here.
that's all right.
That would be dovetailed
Well,
into.
We're gonna give him a homework assignment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Make sure he reads it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think this is the vulnerability assessment and the data that came from that. I mean, that's so valuable for like what we're talking about, filling in grant applications, just easy plug and play, informing our decision making for, how we're gonna pick projects, how we're gonna prioritize and choose. But I think it also gives us that baseline. It tells us where we're at in terms of our risk, our exposure, our vulnerability, and all of the different categories that, we're talking about here. So I think there's a lot that there's a lot of next steps, a lot of directions we could take this. So I want to talk with you all today about what your thoughts are for those immediate next steps and recommendations for where we can advance. And so I have a couple of slides here that I just want to give you a little more context about what's happening here at the county to help frame this discussion. So the federal funding cuts so FEMA has experienced those federal funding cuts, right? And like we mentioned, a lot of the work for emergency preparedness, mitigation, and planning work, really, it's a lot of planning projects. That funding is essentially gone or going away or getting restructured, right? So our emergency manager here at the county presented to county council on May 8th and gave them a kind of overview of what these federal funding cuts are going to mean for the county in relation to 9 different bullets. There were three kind of areas that he prioritized in that presentation that I think relate to the work we're doing in resilience and sustainability. So it's prioritizing hazard mitigation, moving fast on resilience projects that are currently in the pipeline, and then deepening our relationships with the private sector and NGOs and faith-based groups. And these 9 recommendations were all approved by council. Direction was given for staff to start working on them. But now these are the 3 that are falling to us to figure out how we can implement these actions, right? And so we've talked about today these strategies, these 11 strategies that came out of the vulnerability assessment. And today, Stephen went through strategy 1, the programmatic approach to flood mitigation. We also talked about strategy number 7, thank you, the climate resilient brownfields redevelopment. So those are 2 that are in the works right now, but in our conversations today, we've also seen some interest in number 8, building out a local resilience fund. Also number 9, a structured resilience governance, which to me means that interdepartmental working group and perhaps getting those municipalities together too. We have done some work in resilience codes and updated some of those codes. And emergency services planning, I think, is also where I want to go next. So this is just to say we have a list of options and things we can prioritize. We talked about a few things today. So I want to see what your recommendation would be for where to go next. But before we have that discussion, I wanted to bring up, if you remember one of the first slides that Stephen showed, where it was a graph about where the response was when the acute shock happened, and then there's a dip, right? And it goes up to recovery, and that recovery is better and stronger if we're better positioned before the event, right? And so the South Carolina VOAD, it's the state organizing structure for these umbrella organizations that include nonprofits, faith-based communities, service providers that really support those unmet needs for individuals after a disaster. They're the groups that kind of find find the resources for the people that have, you know, tried to get FEMA funding already, and they've tried to do that SBA loan funding already, and they just, they're falling, right? And then these groups kind of bring them, try to make them as whole as they can. So there's been a lot of interest across the state in reestablishing what's called a VOAD, a Voluntary Organization Active in Disaster, at kind of the local level. So there's a national VOAD, there's a state of South Carolina VOAD, and then these colored blocks here are where the regional VOADs are. And so Charleston, Berkeley, and Dorchester, at one time there was a regional VOAD that was active, I think right after the 2015 floods. That was when they kind of started convening, but that group has gone dormant. So what I've been doing is working on reestablishing that group, getting partners together who are in each of these kind of areas of service, and pulling them together into a workshop that we're having next week to just reintroduce folks, kind of know who's doing what and how we can leverage support. So this is again at the back end. This is the recovery piece. So we're trying to put some things in place so that if, you know, folks need support after a disaster, that we've got a group here that can kind of meet those needs. That leads into kind of that emergency services planning piece.
That meeting next week, would you let us know? Maybe a couple of us are available, we could attend.
Sure.
And support.
Yeah, I'll send you the invitation. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
I know you want to do next.
Yeah. No, I'll send that to you. So now I want to talk, we have 15 minutes left in this meeting, and we also have sustainability updates, but let's just see how far we can get with this. Yeah. So the RSAC recommendations for consideration that I'd like you to think about right now are recommending developing an interdepartmental working group that focuses on resilience and sustainability.
Very
I think, yeah, that's high priority. Also identifying and beginning to work on specific resilience strategies.
Can we back up for a minute?
Oh, sure.
Do you have as county meetings where all the department heads come together at one point?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so
Mhm.
have you done that, and where each one you can bring forth this and get everybody's?
Right. So I think that would be a good next step, is to present to that.
Yeah,
Department
we
head,
meet
but-
every, like, first or second Thursday of the month, all department heads.
Mhm.
And then we do one-on-ones with those
Yeah.
that have
Mhm.
really connected to this, so it's open.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
available.
Mhm. And with the climate action plan work, I mean, Ally's been making those connections
Right.
with, you know,
Different groups?
yeah, different groups and department staff, which would likely be a lot of the same folks that we'd want to pull in. And I think that's why that interdepartmental group would be, you know, a good kind of foundation for resilience and sustainability for our division, to kind of pull that group together and convene them.
Yeah, I don't want to jump ahead, but I'm just throwing out again, this is me. Stephen said, when he showed the original graph of Road to Recovery.
Right.
I think you said over 20% of emergency services are vulnerable. There was a number like that, I don't remember.
Yeah, countywide, if I recall, I think it was about 15% of properties that are considered critical facilities are highly vulnerable.
Okay,
Yeah.
so maybe to initiate that, to get people thinking, you might want to consider those 15% properties,
Mhm.
because if they're still vulnerable during a disaster, you're not going to be able to get to the recovery. And that affects the emergency services, affects everyone. So that's probably a good emotional
Mhm.
area to start with everybody.
Yeah.
Because I think everyone can relate to that. And then just taking that and then going into the rest of the areas.
Absolutely.
But that might be a way to start.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Yeah, and then, so to hit on the second one, identifying and beginning working on specific resilience strategies that we mentioned up here, right?
Right.
So, you know, we're working on some of these. I think this local resilience fund really stood out as something folks were interested in. And, you know, the strategies that are in the assessment there's a lot more narrative and context about how that could be done and some, guidance on, how to get that started. All of these have that. But to me, that's what raises to the top is the local resilience fund, and then extreme heat planning is also something that's already kind of in the works. But I mean, there's so many on here that we could do, right? It's the structured resilience governance is the third one that really stands out to me. So I guess I just want to open that discussion and see what else are folks thinking we can like take on right away.
Well,
Scott.
I was thinking like with the climate action plan, how you have that spreadsheet with all of the items. and
Right.
Who are the organizations, who are the people that want to spearhead that or want to partner with those, you could do the similar thing to these 11. Maybe
Right.
something like that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah.
Because I think what you'll find now that some departments are already doing.
Yeah,
a lot of
right.
These things, and other organizations, private, outside, doing theirs.
Yeah, I know, like in zoning and planning, we're constantly working on ordinance changes and
Exactly.
things to address this through the resilience element and everything. And I know we work with stormwater very closely for development projects and
Mhm.
applications, and they are implementing this special protection area,
Mhm. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
So
Using this already, yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I see, we can do a lot of things at once, we don't have to pick one or two or three. To me, I think that local resilience fund is something I want to explore a little bit further and see how we can really make that a reality. Is that something that RSAC would like to recommend staff to take on?
Why not? Very guys, everyone shake your hand.
Yeah. Do it.
Do you want to make a motion?
So moved.
Okay,
Wait, I can't make
perfect.
a motion. So moved.
All right.
Second,
Second.
all in
Thanks.
favor?
Aye.
Nice.
Aye.
Yay, all right, great, thanks.
Thanks, Scott.
yeah.
And then I suppose the first one too with the interdepartmental working group, I mean, that would just be a encouragement that this
Oh,
is
definitely,
something we
yeah.
want to do, right? Yeah. Great,
That's actually key, because if you're not doing that,
right.
and you're not getting buy-in from everyone, it's not
Right.
gonna work.
Mhm. And a lot of the folks that were on the project team to initially develop the resilience or the vulnerability assessment, I mean, those folks I think are the natural folks to start with too, to get them back into this. This third recommendation on here, I want to talk a little bit about, because we talked about the assessment being sort of a baseline for, exposure risk, and also having these strategies in there. But to me, it really seems like in order for us to measure progress, we need to have some metrics attached to it. And then we can say, are we saving more money, to your point, Stuart, or are we, increasing the adaptive capacity in these areas? And that way we can really, tell council that we're making progress on these things. So this is something that would take a little bit more, more capacity to really establish
Well,
those.
I would go back to Stephen and say, with all the work you've done throughout the nation, somebody must have already created some
Yeah.
metrics and key performance indicators.
Oh, please, yeah.
So we have that list of 11 resilient strategies. We also have great strategies out of the climate action plan, plus, individual departments, and emergency management is really pushing on some key priorities as well. So we have all of these awesome efforts happening all over the place. I think kind of key is having a central sort of clearinghouse for not only keeping those efforts organized, but tracking successes, or tracking where maybe there's a little bit of a lag in some of those efforts. I'll just give this example. When I was at the city, we developed what we called FloodStat. I don't know if anyone is familiar with CityStat. It was an initiative. It started in Baltimore. It was led by the Bloomberg Foundation, and their city staff was based primarily around efforts related to crime. But we took the model and we applied it to flooding. And sort of the three key components of making that work were establishing objectives. We call them KPIs, key performance indicators. We very clearly articulated what does success look like. When do we know that we have achieved our milestone? And then number two, what metrics can be used to track success on the way to that milestone? And then number three was an accountability component. And assigning each one of those metrics to a specific department and often to a specific person within that department, that, okay, you are in charge of not only tracking this metric, but moving this metric forward. And it was so great. We made so much progress. I'll give you to kind of put that in perspective. One of our KPIs was to get our number of repetitive loss properties in the city to 0. The county has 200 something, maybe close to 300 repetitive loss properties. The city has close to 1,000 repetitive loss properties. But that was one of our KPIs. We want to get to 0 through whatever it takes, through mitigation, through improving drainage infrastructure, to reduce the flood threat, whatever it took. So we had that metric of tracking our repetitive loss properties, and every year it was my job as a floodplain manager to assess where we stood on repetitive loss properties, and any properties that were on that repetitive loss list that had been mitigated, they can come off that list. So the goal is every year, just chip away at that number, bring that number down, bring that number down. So that's one example of like one of our objectives and then metrics for FloodStat. So it was a great space where we could keep track of all of these different efforts across all these different departments. And every month we all sat in a room like this, and we like put graphs and charts and like little like, you know, needles, like red, yellow, green, like, you know, where do we stand? And it was not only a great way of tracking success and progress, but also a great way, if we didn't see a lot of movement in one of those metrics, we could, you know, talk about why. Like, is the metric not measuring the right thing? Do we need more staff capacity to be working on this particular metric? It's a great way to have that conversation with everybody in the room.
Thank you. Since we need to end at 11, because some people need to leave, I just need to ask, anybody have any public comment? I just want to make sure. Anybody online? Then we can just use the last 3 minutes. And Ally, we're gonna spend all of the time next time, is that right?
Oh my gosh, no, you're
I
good.
think we're in good shape.
Yeah,
Is that-
yesterday. or
Stephen, that
last-
really helped, and I think
Yeah.
that just really helped
Good.
Molly and staff and Ally to come back to how to do that.
Right, yeah. And I think I'll just close on this too. I think the climate action plan has a lot of those key performance indicators as KPIs. And if we can link those with some of the work we're doing with resilience, like that just makes us all that more connected and like easy to communicate what we're doing.
And I challenge everyone,
So,
when you leave here today, because I'm gonna do it, is go home and ask the co-pilot of ChatGPT, what are the metrics that key performance indicators of your progress on resilience initiatives? See what I get. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I've been using it more and more and more, more than Google. It's amazing.
Great.
Okay.
What?
It's a great goal.
Yeah, I mean, let's use the tools that are out there.
Yeah, right.
Stephen, thank you very much, Molly and Ally.
Sure.
Well, thanks. Anything else? Do I have a motion to adjourn? Second. All in favor? Aye.
Second. Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.